Hello. Good afternoon. So good to see so many of you here today. Welcome to this panel about delivering climate-resilient food systems during multiple crises and fragility. This event has been organized by GIZ, FARA, the Forum of Agricultural Research in Africa, and Wageningen University and Research. Just a bit of context for you all. In 2021, there were more than 800 million people affected by hunger, and also billions unable to afford a healthy diet. Equally, there have been a rise in climate-related illnesses, deaths, and even the threat to our mental health and well-being is going up because of climate anxiety. That is something that is starting to take grip. Extreme weather conditions such as floods, storms, droughts are mobilizing people to leave their homes, and a new type of refugee, a climate refugee, is starting to rise. Also, the political instability of wars in certain parts of the world, they are having global ramifications for our food systems. So what is the way forward? That is what we're going to be talking about today. I hope you all enjoy what is going to be a fascinating hour and a half full of thought-provoking discussion and ultimately some solutions through this series of crises that we are currently facing. My name is Kassa Alom. I'm a climate journalist, a presenter for the BBC and various other places. I'm going to be here as your guide through this event. How it's going to be unfolding is this. In a moment, we're going to have a brilliant keynote speech by a true rock star of a speaker. And after that, we're going to have two panel discussions with some brilliant speakers. Firstly, about how we turn policy into implementation. And then it's going to be about the importance of financial investment and the role of science in securing our food systems. Of course, this is all about yourselves. So there's going to be an opportunity for you to ask our panelists some questions at certain moments. So please do keep your questions in mind when listening to what they are saying. Then we're also going to finish with an inspirational speech from the next generation that I hope is going to leave you all with a call to action of what we need to do. Plenty to look forward to, so let me introduce you first to our keynote speaker, Director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, a professor at the Institute of Earth and Environmental Science at Potsdam University, professor in water systems and global sustainability at Stockholm University. It's Professor Dr. Johan Rockström. Let's have a round of applause.
Thanks, Kassa, Your Excellencies, colleagues, friends. Over the past 50 years, we've had 3 spikes of global food prices according to the FAO Food Index. It was the crisis of the oil crisis in the 1970s. It was the food crisis that spurred the Arab Spring, and it is today. And today is the highest spike of them all. And the reason for this is that we have 4 interconnected crises that are simultaneously hitting the food system. The climate crisis, the ecological crisis, the tail end of a pandemic, which is a zoonosis, the exponential rise of pandemics, all of them coming from unsustainable exploitation of nature, spilling over through domestic animals, which is part of the food system, over to humans, and then the geopolitical instability in the world. 2 days ago, we released the 10 new insights in climate science, showing scientifically that this is starting to hit walls in terms of even adaptation, that we're coming into hard limits because of the rising frequency and the rising intensity of droughts, floods, heat waves, disease patterns that all hit the food system, which we have data on is broken, not only in terms of quantity, in terms of nutrition, but also in terms of livelihoods and basic development. And on top of this, we have 1.2 degrees Celsius of global mean surface temperature rise, the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age 12,000 years ago, well before we even invented agriculture, which was a part of the stability of the planet when we left the last ice age of the 14 degrees Celsius world plus minus 0.5 degrees. Now we are at 1.2 and we see the impacts. 4 years of drought in the Horn of Africa, 200 million people facing starvation. We are truly in a situation which is also confirmed by the IPCC. You've seen this data, the 6th assessment of the IPCC showing in the dark red, yellow colors the regions that are at risk of facing 20 to 30% reductions of food production already within the next 30 to 40 years because of human-induced climate change. Now, this is in itself a key entry point for investments in climate resilience, but it's even more challenging than that. And that is the topic of this session, because we also have more and more scientific evidence that climate change interacts with food insecurity, leads to social instability, displacement, migration, and conflict. This map shows the first layering in a project that we're working with support from the German Foreign Office on weathering risks. The layering of climate change with fragility, with drought-induced undermining of food security. And just look at the spots of where the conflicts are playing out today and where you have drought-induced undermining. We cannot say that there's a scientifically statistical correlation, but it's very strong indeed. And this is happening in a planet where the food system is losing more and more resilience because we're transgressing planetary boundaries. In the Eat Lancet Commission, the first time health scientists, sustainability scientists, and food system scientists gathered to define the planetary health diet of a universal definition of what gives best health outcomes for humanity and for the planet, we find, which you see on this graph, that for all the planetary boundaries that were in the deep red, it's all driven by the food system. So climate change, loss of biodiversity, overuse of fresh water, overloading of nutrients, and loss of biodiversity, the primary driver is the food system. But we show also scientifically that for a transition into a safe future which is more resilient, we need a transition that won't be enough of just decarbonizing the energy system. We have now evidence that sustainable intensification of agriculture production, but also reducing food waste and building more resilient value chains in the livelihood systems is an absolute necessity to have any chance of holding the Paris agreements well below 2 and landing at 1.5. What is the journey then to close this? Well, the journey is the following. We need to decarbonize the global energy system, shown here in gray. That's what we debate all the time, cutting emissions by half every decade. But the food system has this red and yellow lines you see here, which is methane and nitrous oxide. That is a very big, important challenge to reduce that as much as possible. But remember that the global food system, to be more resilient, must also be a carbon sequestering system. So the wedge of the dark red here, which is a source, needs to transition, as you see, by mid-century to become a sink. So this is an agricultural revolution. So I would argue today that we have to integrate adaptation with mitigation into a resilience framework for agricultural development. Make agriculture more coping with stress and shocks, but also being a part of the solution towards a zero carbon future. That is what I call adaptive management in a new realm of climate resilience. And therefore, this session is so important to have the opportunity to discuss this together. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Johan Rockström. Incredible speech. And before I invite my panel on, I mean, of course, as we've just been hearing there about how there is this nexus, this link between climate change, food security, conflict. I just want to share a quick story. I mean, recently I was in Zambia. The car I was traveling in, of course, broke down. So I went for a little walk and I spoke to a local street food seller called Bridget. She sells potato chips that she makes herself. She's put the price up herself 3 times since the start of the year because of the rise of food costs, drought, floods, and even the price of cooking oil has gone up from $5 for 5 kilos to about 15. So those are unsustainable for her, and she's worried that if she keeps putting the prices up, it may lose all her business because the people that buy the chips off her are the farmers who themselves are making less money. So I just wanted to share that because it's real people, it's real problems, it's real stories. So what are the solutions? Well, let's invite our first panel to talk a little bit about that. Can I have a round of applause for Ms. Kitty van der Heijden, Director General for International Cooperation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Netherlands, His Excellency Dr. Soksilo, General Secretary, Council for Rural Development and Agriculture in Cambodia, Ms. Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven, Board of GIZ, and also Dr. Joao Puri, Associate Vice President of IFAD, India. Welcome. So thank you very much. While we wait for Dr. Joao Puri to sit down, I will say that at the end of this, there will be a chance for you all to ask some questions, so please do get them ready. But I'd love to start with Ms. Kitty van der Heijden first of all. If you don't mind. Sorry, I'll let you do that first, because it's very important that we stay hydrated. Why don't you tell me, if you don't mind, how is the Netherlands contributing to improving resilience and effectively what we need next to policy processes, for example, like this COP, to improve resilience as well?
Look, I mean, that's the million-dollar question, right? If there would be an easy answer, probably none of us would be here, but we would be actually doing this in the field. So let's start with the fact that this is complicated. This is, I would say, a spaghetti bowl of deeply interrelated, complex economic, political, ecological, and development angles. So, oh, sorry for that. So where I start from is from the development angle, right? I'm the DG for development, so I start with poverty. That's why this is important. I start with the equity issue, the poverty issue, the inequality issue, and the fact that 1 in 8 people in this planet go to bed hungry, and that in the region that I spent a previous part of my life, in Ethiopia, the northern part, 40% of children are stunted because they don't have enough food, which leads to lifelong cognitive disabilities. That generation is basically wasted in many ways. So food security is important for that. You mentioned the issue of conflict, and it's between herders and farmers, it's between countries, it's between regions. So from a conflict perspective, if you want development, that's why food security matters. It's important to reduce displacement, migration, CO2, as Johan mentioned, nitrogen, and water stress. And we don't talk enough about water. I mean, where we work in the most poor, the most conflict-prone, the most fragile, the most climate-impacted countries in the world, in the Horn of Africa and in the Sahel. And what we try to do really is do a holistic approach where that spaghetti bowl really works. If I take a country like South Sudan, I just spoke to the minister, 8 out of 10 states are flooded at the moment. The rest is in a deep drought. More than half of the population at this moment is facing malnutrition, IPC 3 level, so that's really bad. 3 million people are facing starvation. I mean, those are things that you can't afford. So I want to stay very close to what I can influence. I can ask many things from many people. What I can influence and what I need is that we as donors, we as international community, start changing the way we do business. We need a much more integral approach between the environment issues. I have a food silo, I have a water silo, I have a climate silo, so these need to be interlinked. I need diplomacy, so security, migration to come in, and I need to look at poverty, gender, and inequality. We need a much less jurisdictional approach. All of us adopt a country. That's where we work. We like Mali, but we may not like Chad. Sorry, none of this can be done at a jurisdictional approach. We need more regional approaches, working with local knowledge, and we tend to bring our own knowledge rather than local knowledge. Focus much more not on monitoring for accountability, right? Accountability for money and accountability for results, that's important, but really about what's not going well, because we know what's not going well. And then lastly, really changing our own business models as a donor. Not thinking in 3-year projects, but thinking in long-term holistic approach. So I just signed a 10-year project, which means that it goes over 3 ministers and 3 cabinets for 100 million. If I look aged beyond my years, that's because I had to talk till I was blue in the face with my auditors. So changing the way we do business to deal with these complex interrelated problems that Johan was referring to, that's what we need.
Thank you very much. No, you actually answered my second question there in your answer there, which was all about what are the next steps that the Netherlands is going to take after COP. So it's really good. Thank you very much. If there are more questions on that focus on what the Netherlands is going to be doing, please do keep them in mind, and we will come back to them when we open this up to the audience. I'd like to now talk to His Excellency Dr. Soksilo. How has Cambodia reacted to the global crisis to ensure the sustainable food systems in Cambodia?
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Gaza. Let me take this opportunity to underline that the situation described by Mr. Johan Rockström in his keynote speech, it is very relevant to the challenge that we are facing in Cambodia. Cambodia is among the countries of Southeast Asia which as the most exposed and vulnerable to climate change. And in December and October this year, nearly all the provinces are affected by flooding, and more than 100,000 of families become flooding and fell into food insecurity. And the right field social infrastructure, road irrigation system damaged, and the government have spent $1 million for spending on social assistance program to support the poor and the flooded victim, and the rehabilitation of the infrastructure, and more than 6,300 tons of paddy rice seed are distributed to farmers who are affected by flood for their rehabilitation their farming system. And we have seen that the effect of COVID-19 pandemic and the related price shock, where the poverty rate in Cambodia increased and many rural households face the risk of falling back into poverty. The global impact of the war in Ukraine and prolongs and deepens the economic crisis. Cambodia is in preparation of the extension of our social protection program to ensure the social stability to cope with the high inflation and impact by the multiple of global crisis, in addition to the current social protection program that provide cash transfer to pregnant women and children under 2 years, and the cash transfer program for the people who are affected by COVID-19. And we recognize that the need to think beyond the food security and nutrition as the agriculture and health problem, to understanding how the pressing issue of climate change and all the crises can address through change in the food system without compromising to the nutrition. And we need to understand the wider picture, including the recommendation of the recognition of the trade-off and co-benefit for climate change, food system, and nutrition. And we have started more on toward to on a food system approach in our national food system dialogue and in the development of the national strategies in 2017.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. That's His Excellency Dr. Sok Silo there. So I'd like to now come to Ms. Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven from GIZ. How does GIZ address this nexus between, as I mentioned, climate change, food security, and fragility?
Yeah, many thanks. And let me first actually thank Johan Rockström again for bringing this sense of urgency to the room and to our debate. And actually what you have illustrated to us, that we are not only have to face a severe food crisis, and that is actually taking lives, but at the same time we have to transform the whole food system globally in a sense that the whole system can deliver the contribution to climate protection that is needed. And this is even a bigger transformative shift that has to happen, but we should bear this in mind as well. One could also frame it in a different kind. The less we do a mitigation, the more we are going to invest in adaptation. And if this is not being done right, I mean, if we don't take the right preventive measures, preserve actually our soils, try to make sure that we have sufficient water and we use it efficiently, etc., we are going to spend more and more money on loss and damage. And this is the other equation that we are talking about at this COP27. So how should we approach this concretely? And let me start perhaps by an example. It's also from South Sudan, like the one that Kitty actually started with. When we started to work in East African regions on peace mediation, it was about conflicts about resources between farmers and herders in South Sudan, in other parts of the region. But of course, climate drought actually, the drought provoked by climate change exacerbates the type of conflicts. So what we try to do actually in order to embrace this in a complex manner, that when we enter into a program that deals with climate protection or with adaptation issues, that at the same time we do observe whether we are operating in a region that is actually faced with fragility. And we try to do the same that we have learned to do in peace building mechanisms, so we weave into some kind of peace element. The same applies, I think, when we do work in the space of climate and security. So when we do specific work in this respect, we should also figure out what kind of peace-building operations, what kind of extra co-benefit we can generate for climate resilience. For instance, by bringing stakeholders together, by making sure that the municipal level is on board, and that actually we have a big buy-in by many stakeholders from the society. What we have learned over time, I would like to give you 3 additional entry points. I think what is more needed than ever is that our doing is evidence-based and we use the right data. And we have to implement now programs that also pay off in 30 and 40 years' time. In many fronts on adaptation to climate change, we have been working in incremental terms, not really seeing what lies ahead of us. And this may not bring the right, actually, information to decision makers. For instance, by financing and by implementing climate risk analysis that actually capture these issues, and Kitty spoke about the water issue as one very essential issue when it comes to food security and adaptation to climate change. We should know actually what kind of water scarcity are we going to face in 30 years' time, and what does this mean for investments on adaptation and mitigation nowadays? How the economy has to be changed so that it can be actually not so actually fragile to water scarcity, just to give you an example. So we are doing this together with the KIC. So data and evidence becomes more important. Second point is actually we are trying to provide advice and support to those partners that try to factor in this nexus into their national adaptation plans and their NDCs. Traditionally, the national adaptation plans were really like short-term, and additionally, they didn't actually interconnect the dots, the different sectors, so they didn't work across the aisles. And on the NDC partnership, there again, GIZ as a constitutional member, we try to make sure that issues beyond climate are taken on board.
Thank you very much for those answers there, Ms. Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven. All right, I'd like to come to Dr. Joe Puri now, who is the Associate Vice President of IFAD in India. Thank you so much for your time. From your perspective, what would you say are the key bottlenecks at a country level, for example, policy, finance, that sometimes perhaps stall progress towards food systems that are resilient in the face of all these multiple crises?
Thank you so much, Casa. So, while I'm not going to try and be exhaustive in my 3-minute response to you, I'm going to speak about one key bottleneck that I think we all acknowledge, but we've got to figure out ways to do better with, and which is financing. Right? So at country level, we all recognize that it is important to invest in resilience and adaptation because it makes sense at the local level for the farmer, it makes sense for the farmers' organizations, it makes sense for the off-taker companies that are buying that product, and it makes sense for the national government because then they don't have to pay for humanitarian assistance every time a shock occurs. So clearly the incentives are all aligned. it also makes sense for a private sector agency or a private sector firm to be thinking about resilience, because once they invest in resilience, they know that their investment is secure and they get their returns on investment. So what is missing? What is missing that we don't get to see? Essentially, the $379 trillion that is currently lying as assets under management globally, and 1% of that is required for us to meet the SDG financing gap, but yet we can't seem to mobilize it or catalyze it. So I want to talk about three things. I think the first challenge is measurability or accountability, and Ingrid thankfully spoke about that. The second is risk, and I'll talk about that a little bit. And the third is scale, and Kitty alluded to that a little bit as well. Right. So the first question is measurability. The fact is that the private sector, which is really the source that I need if I want to amplify the impacts that IFAD, so IFAD works with small-scale farmers. We put in approximately $1.5 billion on adaptation every replenishment period, and we leverage it. For every dollar, we leverage it 4 times, right? But clearly, it's important that we bring in the private sector. For them, measurability is important. For our portfolio, we found, and we applied an index for adaptation and resilience, and we found that we were able to, as a consequence of IFAD's investments, over a period of 8 years, able to increase the resilience of people that we were targeting over the counterfactual by 13%, with very good standard errors. So if you're interested in that, we've got the standard errors as well, right? So that we've got the measurement. But the second part is really the scale. And I think we really need to bring in the fact that, yes, 1/3 of our overall food is produced by small-scale farmers. They are clearly the source of resilient food systems if ever we wanted to build them. So if we can really find the economies of scale by aggregating these, we've got the scale. And we are working with farmers' organizations and contracting with large off-takers to essentially get to that. The third part is risk. And I think that's where I'm finding the missing middle. So clearly there's risk because you've got to invest in an area or geographies or with people that are currently non-banked or are not credit worthy. So what we do, what IFAD does with improving their credit worthiness or their bankability or their credit rating is to essentially provide or inject liquidity into public development banks, into national development banks, so that they are able to on-lend in ratios of more than 30 times to groups of people, to farmers, to smallholders, that is at lower rates of interest, so lower rates of interest, longer tenors, and with lesser requirements with respect to collateral. And that means that you are increasing then the financial affordability and accessibility of populations. This is happening with the Great Green Wall work that we are doing in West and Central Africa across 11 countries. It's also happening in countries like Mozambique, where we are working with specific value chains that are deforestation-free. We are also working in Malawi, we are working in Bolivia, where essentially the infrastructure that is being provided is helping to de-risk the investments on the ground. And this leads to then what is called an assembling of finance, because we've got different sources of financing essentially coming along. Grant financing of first loss taking facilities at the bottom, then those that are able to provide senior debt, junior debt, and others. And then we can assemble that along with, of course, the GCF, the GEF, and the Adaptation Fund that can also provide a lot of grant and concessional financing. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. I'm really pleased that you all stuck to time as well, so congratulations to you all there. Thank you very much. Right, we have about 10 minutes or so, and I would like to invite you all now to ask some questions. I want to hear your thoughts, your feelings on what our panelists have said. Can you relate to what is being discussed? Do you think the solutions proposed are going in the right direction? These are the sorts of things that I'd like for you to think about. Also, if you are watching on the YouTube or from home, please do contribute by leaving a question in the comments. We will try to get some of them answered too if we are able to. But right now, over to yourselves. Simply raise your hand and we shall bring a microphone over. Right, let's go into the corner over there, to the gentleman in the striped polo, then the lady in the red jacket.
Thank you very much. My name is Cesar Katebe from Women's Life Wellness Foundation. My question is directed at the lady next to you. She talked about long-term financing that targets women. For me, particularly of interest is, I'm coming from a women's rights organization, so my interest is, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I think that was for Miss Kitty van der Heijden, but do you need the question repeated? Yes, please, would you repeat the question for us?
Okay, yeah, my question is, you talked about long-term financing from 5 to 10 years. For me, I think that's a route to go, purely because long-term projects tend to have a bigger, higher impact to project beneficiaries. And I do know that, for example, when you look at the impact that the global climate crisis is having on women, they are the ones that are fearing the brunt of this crisis. Surely when you do bring out financing that targets long-term, the yields are quite much bigger and has a tendency to uplift women out of that crisis. So for me, it's a comment that is directed at you to see how even other donors could be able to leverage on, because we know from a civil society background is that long-term projects have a bigger impact on people's livelihoods, especially women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a comment and something that I actually wanted to build upon as well. Just talk to us about the reasoning for extending that length and what you feel the benefits will also be and why others perhaps should be following that example.
Look, I think as development community, we are learning now that we are dealing with systemic problems. And you can't deal with systemic projects in a 3-year cycle. I mean, that's just insane. But it's the way we've been organized for, how long have we done development cooperation? 60, 70 years? And we're locked in a modality that simply isn't suitable for the time we're in, which is interconnected problems, which are all long-term transformational. So that's why we've said we have to break out of the cycle of a new project every 3 years or every 4 years. It creates an onerous burden on our NGOs or on government partners that need to keep reporting. My people can't go to the field because they are endlessly reviewing progress reports. So we need to find a different way of doing business. And that is a long-term approach. Yes, 10 years. It's politically incredibly difficult through our budget cycles, where you have adaptive learning and where you engage local knowledge and local communities much better than we've done before. So that's the whole idea behind long-term financing. I am finding that more and more donors are thinking that we need to do this, but we need auditors to come along. Well, I am a fiscal economist by background. I can tell you they are the hardest nut to crack. And we need our taxpayers to come along. But I think slowly we are shifting, and as you've seen with Johan's presentations, all these issues are systemic. They're all interrelated. You can't do that in one project. So there's just no other way. If you want to be effective, you go long-term, you go adaptive, you go local. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. Is there a comment from Dr. Joe Puri, also to build on what Kitty has been saying?
Yeah, thank you so much, Kasa. So I just want to add to what Kitty said. We're also what's called an international financing institution. And what that means, and if you read a little bit about the work of the economists who got the Nobel Prize this year, they speak about financial intermediation. And that's exactly what we do. When you save money in a bank, you want to save it for the short term because you want to be able to withdraw it. But what a financial intermediary like IFAD does is essentially it lends for the long term. So even though we borrow for the short term in periods of 4 years or so, which is the political cycle, but we on lend for 8 years. And now we are going even more programmatic. So we are doing 8-year investments and then 8-year investments that build on previous ones.
Thank you very much. Right, we have a question from the lady in the red jacket. Then I think there was a very strong arm in the air there at the back, so we'll definitely go there. And if we have time after that, we'll try and get one more in. But over to you, madam.
Thank you. My question goes to the presenter from GIZ. I think there was an issue in terms of documenting the indigenous knowledge. I'm coming from Zambia Climate Change Network, where we are coordinating activities, and I'm glad that the moderator has a face in terms of the stories around the food systems. So one of it has to do with packaging the indigenous knowledge in terms of the data that I think the colleague from IFAD is mentioning, in terms of having the data that now speaks. So we seem to be having a shift of moving, especially the private sector, getting to move the agenda as opposed to the indigenous farmers who should be moving the agenda. So how could you help in this situation? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's get an answer now from Ms. Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, for GIZ, what we do when we work in the field of knowledge sharing or data collection, or even if we develop some approaches on the field, I think for us it's absolutely core and center that we do this together with local communities. I mean, they are not only those that have the knowledge, because and they are facing the changing conditions, at the same time they are also the agents of change. So this is actually our approach. It's so to say, we have to bring in people on board. It's a whole of society approach. Even if we want to shift bigger systems, we have to bring on board the local level, the macro level, and make them work together. And so we don't have like one size fits all approaches, but we really listen to people, make sure that when we go to local communities, this is tailor-made and embeds fully and wholeheartedly what they would like to see as their vision for resilience and knowledge sharing. This, of course, and this may relate to Kitty's point, requires more time. And sometimes it's not that easy to balance it when you are, for instance, in an emergency situation. If you really want to work in a very inclusive and comprehensive way, but at the same time you have to deliver. But we have faced over time that when you really bring people on board in inclusive approaches and recognize the knowledge that is already available at the local level, those solutions are much more sustainable in the long run. So these pre-investments, they really pay off. This is one of the lessons learned that we have experienced in many, many countries.
Thank you very much for your answer. So we only have time for one more question, which I believe will be for the woman at the back there. Closest to you, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Malini Mehra, and I am with Globe International. It's an organization of legislators. I want to pick up, Kitty, on the point that you had made about accountability. The issues are not just accountability in finance. The issues are about accountability in delivery. I did my accountability for delivery, absolutely essential. My background is in development, and for 30 years I have seen the siloization become even worse. So you mentioned the silos of food, energy, water, gender. There are many. However, we have international frameworks for managing risk. We have the Sendai framework, of course, since 2015. Before then, we've had 10 years of the Hyogo framework. So the example that you gave of Pakistan, my region, when you said that, okay, this is absolutely catastrophic, yes, but we knew it was going to be a catastrophe because we had the 2010 floods. What we have seen is an abject failure of political leadership and risk governance. And unless we ensure that in countries that we charge our leaders with delivery, with accountability, it's not going to happen. How do you do that? Communities have a key role, but parliamentarians have the fundamental role. So when you are investing in countries on 3 or 5 or 10-year cycles, it's the role of Parliament to ensure that support which is coming from external sources into the country is given good public value, that they interrogate and demand good delivery from all institutions throughout government. And I'd like to see much greater emphasis on that. I'm a member of the GAR 2022 advisory body. This year will be focused on systemic risk, multi-hazard risk response. I would love to see all of you talk about risk governance and invoke the Sendai framework, because we have the broad framework already in place. My question to you is, how can we ensure that going forward we are addressing risk and resilience at every level? Thank you.
Thank you. Why don't we talk about the accountability there? It's a very fair point. Lots of promises are constantly made, but when those promises aren't completely met, what accountability is there, and what actually can be done there?
Look, I think there's accountability at all different levels, right? There is local accountability to local leaders, there's national accountability through parliaments, and there's international scrutiny here. I mean, the world has promised climate finance, climate action, and where are we? Well, we're falling short on every domain, right? And I think we need to just admit that. I don't think there is an easy answer to that. My answer would be that you need more data to showcase how short we are falling, again, in every domain. We need much more political pressure from the bottom up. Don't just expect leaders to deliver, make them deliver by making sure that we organize the grassroots people. We need the science people like Johan that's bringing the data to us. We need the whole system to work together. And I think, you know, despite I really get depressed every now and then when I'm in venues like this and I know we're falling so short, but at least we have an option to come together, to talk, to get the science, the leaders to come together and to acknowledge it. There is one issue where, you know, we're talking foods, we're talking finance, we're talking climate, that I just want to call your attention to, and that is water. It's great to talk about food, but you cannot make food without water. You cannot have a life in dignity if there's no water. There is absolutely no Apollo moment, like, holy shit, we have a problem, about water. It's not there, but Pakistan was flooded. The Horn of Africa is suffering a historic drought. Most of the climate impacts come through the hydrological cycle, and we're not giving that the political weight it needs. That's where parliaments and people will need to start pushing, because if there's no water, there's no food, but there's no manufacturing, there's no energy, there's no life. And so one final remark from my side is that there is finally, after 50 years, the first UN water conference coming in March. You know, the previous time this happened, I was in primary school. Next time, I'll be pushing up the daisies if there is water enough to grow them. This is our Apollo moment for water. If we can't get it organized by then and have leaders stand up and be accountable that, yes, climate change is about bringing temperatures down and emissions down, but it's equally about water and managing the hydrological cycle much better for people's lives and dignity.
Thank you very much for all your questions. I know that there are plenty other questions out there, but that is all we have time for with our first panelist. So let's have a round of applause again for Miss Kitty van der Heijden, His Excellency Dr. Soxilo, Miss Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven, and Dr. Joe Puri. And with that, I will tell you all to please take a seat and enjoy the rest of the panel. And before we get to the next panel on the stage to discuss finance and the role of science in the way forward, I'd love for you now to spend a couple of minutes getting familiar with some of the work being done by GIZ. That's funded by BMZ and partially by the EU as well. Have a look at this video.
Madagascar is one of the countries most affected by the impacts of climate change. About 80% of Malagasy people live off the land as farmers. Poor or failed harvests due to climate change threaten their very livelihoods. A Malagasy-German cooperation project has developed an innovative approach to make farming more resilient to climate change, combining the dissemination of weather-based information with sustainable agroecological practices. New techniques and technologies must not only be learned, they need to be trusted. Therefore, the project partners with local agricultural leaders who act as role models to their peers.
Ny fomba ataoko zany mba haharesy lahatsy ireo satria ty ila mety tsy hino fa tsy fomba mahazatsy zany rahay.
One of the new technologies, however, is showing to her fellow farmers is a hotline that directly informs them about current meteorological conditions and what they might mean for agriculture, allowing farmers to plan based on weather forecasts. The Service 321 allows accessing weather information via basic mobile phones. It now also provides crop-specific information tailored to the caller's needs and immediate recommendations on good farming practices for the entire cropping cycle. Malagasy farmers have consulted these cropping calendars on the hotline more than 1.3 million times and have gained valuable information for their farming practices.
So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes talking to Ms. Rebecca Sarku, who obtained her PhD at Wageningen University in 2021 last year, interested in climate change adaptation, information services, digital information systems, and also the governance of food systems. She co-designed a weather app with farmers to enable data collection on local weather indicators, things such as the appearance of birds, ants, insects, and for co-producing forecast information with scientific weather data as well. Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. It's a true pleasure to hear from you. Tell me a little bit about the app and how it works.
Good. Hello. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me here to talk about my research. And it's interesting that a colleague over there raised an issue about local knowledge, and then hearing the panel talk about local solutions and so on. So for my research, when I got to the community, it's synonymous to the situation, the arid condition occurring in this video that we've watched briefly. So you realize that farmers were trying to do their own thing, but they have their local knowledge. They have their local ideas of saying, for example, one critical example I usually give is about the flower, the blossoming of a plant during spring. If more flowers are created or formed on a tree, it gives them an idea that this season we can expect heavy rainfall. I got the idea one time when they told me this is going to happen, and it happened. So in the PhD, I changed the focus of my objective to collect these local solutions and digitalize it into a web-based app. Then I trained the farmers how to use this app, just like these farmers. So first of all, there was no smartphone in the villages, but we had to learn how to scroll, how to swipe. And then this information, these superstitious stories, became something that is scientific, that we can integrate. So integrating local solution into scientific ideas. So this is how it came about. And now today, the app can be found on at Google Play Store. It's called Weather App Scale. So interesting results from this local knowledge and local solution.
And you just mentioned there that there were no smartphones in the village. So how do you go from a village that has no smartphones to then having farmers trust that this is something that was going to work? Tell me a little bit about how it was that you were able to get the buy-in from the farmers.
Okay, so first of all, when I introduced the idea of phone, they said, look, this is, we use the simple phone, like, so in Ghana we call it the yam. And I said, look, you can do this. So it's starting from capacity building or training. So some technological solutions, sometimes we think farmers are illiterate, they can't use it, but it's about developing a systematic approach, taking the person through, and then you realize that these solutions can be used by an illiterate farmer. For example, when it comes to giving feedback with a smartphone, you use the recorder, the voice recorder, and then you send, hello, this, I have observed there's a bird today, so let's expect rainfall in the evening. So it starts from using technology and exploring simple solutions with technology, and it worked from my community. So I'll say in the context where I studied or I conducted this research, they were willing, I spoke with them, and they were willing to follow me or trust me. And it's also about building trust in the communities. You Brilliant. Need to do that first.
Thank you very much. That's been fascinating to learn. Local knowledge combined with scientific, fact-based evidence to combine a solution that can then help farmers and then increase food resilience and security. Appreciate that. Thank you very much for your time. That's Miss Rebecca Sarku there. Right, it's after 2. It's almost 2:10. Time has flown. It's time for our second panel now. And I'd like you all to give a big round of applause to Dr. Yemi Akinbamijo, Executive Director of FARA, here to speak about science issues from Ghana. Also, we've got Miss Viktoria de Bourbon de Parme, lead for Food Systems Transformation, World Benchmarking Alliance from Netherlands. Also, Professor Dr. Martin Kropff, Managing Director of Resilient Agri-Food Systems, Professor at Wageningen University Research as well from Netherlands. And also Dr. Joao Campari, who's a global leader of food practice at the WWF, and then from Brazil as well. So thank you all. Let's have a round of applause for our second panelist, please. So I'm going to come straight to it with yourself, Dr. Yemi. Africa, we've heard a lot of questions about Africa already, which is fantastic, a lot of engagement there. It's currently at the center of the struggles to feed its populace, build resilient agriculture and food systems. So considering the role of your organization, what are the core elements of Africa's common position on this, and how is this going to change?
Okay, well, thank you very much. Indeed, Africa has been the epicenter when you talk about issues around the vulnerable elements, vulnerable geographic spaces in climate issues. And there has been reason to actually feel that, yes, Africa has the short end of the stick. And for many reasons, there's been a lot of conversation around transformation of the agricultural system in Africa, but it has not happened. And for many years and decades, we still grapple with being able to beat the climate nuances. We still grapple to feed the teeming population of the continent. So right now, what is FARA doing? FARA is the continental organization that is charged with ensuring that we keep Africa food and nutrition secure. And it's also the technical arm of the African Union. So one of the things we do is to find a way to have to support the policies of the leaders in terms of actualizing what is called the Malabo Declaration, doubling the productivity of our agricultural systems. And one of the challenges there is that you really cannot double agricultural productivity outside science. And the challenge there is to be able to do this in a sustainable way, because we talk about sustainable intensification and so on. The maxim is you have to use half the resources to produce twice the requirements. So this is a very, very difficult scenario, but it is not undoable if we have the appropriate science to be able to deliver this. Now, when you look at the situation confronting the African situation, it's also the continent that seems to have the highest science deficit. So we've always known this, that agriculture responds largely to biology. It responds to science, not social movements. Social movements have their own, has its own part, has its own role. But at the end of the day, what will move the needle is a function of how much of science do we have in the system. The last segment that held here, we're talking about issues around methane emissions and how to manage this in ruminant production. And I was privileged to contribute to that segment by saying that animal systems will always be animal systems, but it will only respond to how much science you do to be able to see how you juggle the metabolism of this animal. So in a nutshell, we really need to see how much of science can we put into the system to be able to drive a productive, sustainable system for the continent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yemi. A clear message there about investment in science needed in Africa, and that is what your organization is championing and trying to do. I'd like to come to Ms. Viktoria de Bourbon de Parme now. Talk to me, the importance of finance. Tell me about the importance of finance to deliver food systems, innovation, and also the need for embedding resilience into value chains, and how that both highlights the important role of the private sector. Tell me a little bit about that. How do you see that role, and how does the World Benchmarking Alliance contribute to ensuring that goes ahead? If you just press the red button there.
Yeah.
There you go.
Thanks very much, Kaza. And to start with the role of the private sector, which is actually very simple. The private sector is the key actor in food systems, unless, of course, we look at situations of humanitarian crises and conflicts. The role of the private sector is to deliver food and to produce food by farm businesses, by agriculture input businesses, by food and beverage manufacturers, all the way to retailers. And our food systems are currently dominated by global players. They are sourcing and producing, selling food to every corners of the world. And they have evolved to being giants and focusing on quantity. They actually, as Yemi pointed out, they have the knowledge how to halve the resources and double the yield. So we need to use them. We need to push them on delivering on equitable, healthy, and sustainable food systems. Actually, we know what it takes to get that done. So now is the time to hold the private sector accountable. And I'm delighted to see here at COP27 that food systems are prominently discussed. I've also noticed that there is a lot of attention going into preparing for COP28, for our global stocktake, monitoring and measuring where we stand now and how we are progressing year to year is crucial to realize the actions that we need at the speed and scale required. And my organization, the World Benchmarking Alliance, spent over 3 years to integrate all the existing standards, frameworks, and globally agreed metrics to be able to measure the private sector on this important transformation. It's available in the Food and Agriculture Benchmark, and it's nothing new. It's integrating science-based targets to reduce emissions. It has integrated ILO standards on respecting human rights across the value chain, and it also looks at how the private sector should be improving its performance to deliver and improve availability and accessibility of healthy foods. But they're lagging in great amounts. If we look at these 350 companies and focus in on GHG emissions, only 7% of these companies have a target that is aligned with the Paris Agreement. Half of them have some vague, fancy target and a net zero approach, but we need this independent analysis to be able to hold private sector accountable. So I urge you all here today to use the work that is out there and to have an effective stocktake and hold businesses to account to deliver on these global goals. In several pavilions last week and today, I heard discussions about improved metrics, clearer definitions, but we cannot deliberate the perfect scientific metrics until water is already reaching our waistlines and flooding our livelihoods. We need pragmatic action and we need accountability. And actually, accountability will lead to change. It will lead to action by the private sector. An example of that is the G7 Sustainable Supply Chain Initiative. Companies have pledged, but they have pledged to improve against an independent mechanism, an independent monitoring by the Food and Agriculture Benchmark. 75% of the companies have improved. Another example is a project that IFAD and World Bank are working on to develop a tool for national governments to measure the investments going into food systems. And actually, in an IFAD report, it was been pointed out that from the global climate financing, only 3% is going into food and agriculture. So I want you all to stay hopeful, considering, despite all the urgency, but also use your time here at COP27 to get out of your silos, walk into random pavilions out of your comfort zone, meet new people, and see the interconnectedness of climate, food, nature, agriculture, health, nutrition, water. Use your time to connect, and then use your voice to hold parties to account to deliver a future that works for us all.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Let's turn to Professor Dr. Martin Kropff, Managing Director of Resilient Agri-Food System at CGIAR. You have a whole career's worth of worldwide experience to draw upon here in resilient agri-food systems. Just tell us then, what are important developments in the years ahead to increase resilience?
Yeah, thank you very much, and great introductions here, and also your request, we need action, and that's also my conclusion as well. There's so much impressive work that has been going on in our organizations, in Wageningen and in CGIAR, but also elsewhere. So we have to build on it, be pragmatic. Last week we had a session on climate, food security and peace. Super important, they are related. The scientists are studying it, and now the next phase, how are we going to solve the problem? And that's what I would like to discuss a little bit further, because technology and innovation are critical to increase resilience. So let me say first that they don't work on their own. In science, everybody has a discipline, right? You're a breeder, you're an agronomist, or you're a policy maker, a policy support maker. But the key is we can only have impact when it is demand driven, and I discussed it many times with Yemi, but also when you bring it together. And that is, I think, where we as CGIAR have new initiatives that we are looking in the region. What's the problem? And then where are the bottlenecks and how can we solve them? That's what we call regional integrated initiatives. We don't do it on our own, we do it with all our partners. Hundreds of partners in the global south and of course in the north as well. And Wageningen is a great partner of all the CG projects as well. So when we build on innovations, we have three key scientific areas: genetic innovations, management of crop, livestock and fish, and policies, governance. These are the three components, and you have to bring them together, but of course, new work has to be done in those areas as well. And that's, I think, what is going on very exciting, in a very exciting way. For example, in genetics. Are we making progress? It's enormous, but it's always too slow. When there's a new problem coming in, you want to have a solution next year. But when breeders start working, it takes years to come up with new varieties. That's why also it's good to have international organizations that can bring solutions from continent to continent. We've been doing this, and the impact, for example, of wheat breeding in the CG with partners is something like 3.5 to 4 billion for smallholder farmers return per year. So that's a contribution in that sense, but it's not enough. But also the diversifications. We have a lot of solutions for the staples, wheat, maize, rice, but in the 20 mandate crops of the CG, we have to go beyond. Explore in terms of nutrition, can we have other crops that are also bringing in money, but also be helping with nutrition issues. So we have to learn in a big way, but also livestock and fish. This is an area that I'm really worried about. We have our great institutions in the CGIAR working on livestock and fish, but those systems are so fragile. And in terms of climate change, so the amount of the boundary, or basically the air pollution in the environment and so on, per kilogram of meat is enormously high. And that's where we can learn, for example, from countries like the Netherlands. Although the efficiency is super high, but there we have some other problems because it's a little bit too much in a small country, right? But we have to learn lessons how to innovate and to bring in also social sciences to understand how are things related. How do farmers think? How do consumers like it? Because you can design more nutritious foods. If consumers don't like it, it's going nowhere. So it's the whole value chain from consumer, from breeding, management of crop, livestock and fish, and processing, and then the consumer again. We have to study that as a whole. And as scientists, we are now ready to do so. We are doing it. And that's a contribution from Wageningen that's special, because I always say we need T-shaped skills. Because scientists are good breeders, are good agronomists, are very good policy people or water scientists, but they need to be able to link it, combine it with other disciplines. And in Wageningen, every student is now trained in a period of 9 weeks to learn T-shaped skills. And this is something I think we should introduce globally, because that's the only way that we can find integrated solutions for the farmers. A farmer is also bringing it all together, and that's what we work for. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are any questions on that, then you will have a chance to do so in about 5 minutes' time or so. Dr. Campari, global leader of food practice at WWF. Let's just be frank. If I could give you a truck full of cash, let's say 30 million euros or so, how would you invest that? Any specific regions, hotspots? What are you doing with that money?
That's a very interesting question for somebody that works for an NGO. Those of us who do will have many ideas of how to invest 30 million euros.
I'm asking you.
Yeah, you know, let me start out by reflecting what have we learned with the pandemic and the war. We have learned that supply chains the links of the supply chains are very, very weak on food, right? And when these links are so fragile, they break, and they break at the expense of the poorest populations who, you know, begin to suffer more and more from chronic hunger, malnutrition, and so on, with impacts on the environment as well, as governments try to nationalize their food systems and try to downscale their efforts on their own environmental legislations. So what I think should happen, and I would not blink my eye in choosing, is that the 30 million euros that you potentially would have need to go to invest in the development and implementation of national and subnational roadmaps for action. With the UN Food Systems Summit that ended last year, I think it brought to the fore the role of food systems in the climate change and nature loss agendas. So we need to build systems, food systems that are resilient, right? Because when you develop national roadmaps for national action and subnational action, one of the things that you are also building is resilience to shocks and stresses. This is not to replace global trade, by the way, but give global trade an opportunity and the time to adjust without imposing the impact of these disruptions in the supply chain on people and planet and leaving their livelihoods behind. So that's where I would invest the $30 million. Thank you.
Thank you. I thought you were going to take the money to Las Vegas, but it's good to know that's not where you're taking it. Appreciate that. Right, we have about 10 minutes or so now for some questions from yourselves in the audience. Same thing again, please do pop your hands up, and yeah, we will try to get to you. Usually 3-4 questions. We'll go straight over here to the left-hand side. Yes, we will. So 2 questions already identified. One to the left over here. Can we get a microphone over there? And then certainly one at the back that we missed before. And then we'll take it from there.
Hello, my name is Khalid. I'm doing a lot of projects in the aquaculture and fish farming specifically, which might be a good topic to discuss later on with some panel members. However, my question to you, do we have on a global scale any kind of simulation system using artificial intelligence for the chances of shortage of a specific supply and their impact? I'm here specifically referring to typical emergency response systems that are used for military and used also for communication for other businesses. Such systems are programmed in a way to create simulations all the time and can not only count an enormous amount of inputs, but can be more importantly giving you a lot of warnings way early, like a specific weather condition and what could that impact the production of chicken or fish and so on. Is there something like that? In Netherlands, in the University of Amsterdam, there was a similar project done by the supercomputer there, by a professor, Oseiran, in that particular place, and it was designed for other things. But I think for food security, if such system does not exist, I would use this platform here to ask that we need such a system and to be global, and that can be used for simulating different things, whether on a region level or a country level, or even on a global level.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think there are a number of you who could pick up on that, so who would like to take the lead on that? Okay, there we go. Professor Dr. Martin Kropff.
This is a very important issue, and we have, of course, one of our CG institutes is IFPRI, the Food Policy Institute in Washington, working together with other CGIAR people as well, right? It's not only IFPRI, it's policy people throughout the whole organization, because you talk about different sectors, but they are doing a lot of work on foresight. So right now, they have a lot of these models. It always needs further improvement, but this is a very important thing. And the more data we have, also locally, on weather and those kind of, and extremes, the better we can also advise farmers. And I liked your presentation. That was really brilliant, because when you go to villages where people are still hungry, sometimes they even have smartphones available in that sense, but they can use the smartphone to make decisions when we can better predict what's going to happen, give advice on what to do. And so these models are pretty far developed for the different sectors. So if you want to do more, we can maybe after this session sit down, because this is, I think, number one where we have to start with. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's all about building relationships. That's what we want to do. Focus on food, science, solutions. Any more questions? I know there are lots going ahead. We've already heard from you, sir, so I'll just let other people step in as well. Why don't we go over here? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Marisa. I came from Puerto Rico. I am a farmer over there. And we struggle with climate crisis already very long years ago. And you're talking about taking data today, that we don't have enough time to go to resolve the problems. You are talking about taking data today, and I just think about, it's really sad, because I came from science, that is my base, and I just feel that science is just sequestrated by the big corporations, and this is very sad for me, because we need food for the communities. We need food for the people. We don't need food for big corporations that
What would
take.
you like? Sorry to interrupt you.
I just want to ask. I just want to ask. I just want to ask. Why is science and finance talking about big corporations that decrease the security in the poor community, that we know that decrease the security in natural resource and decrease the security of food, safe food for long distance? We know the long distance increase the contamination. So why we are talking about financial global corporations and global companies to move the food around the world?
Thank you very much for your question.
Shall I take this one?
Please do, please do. I just want to actually have a question that we can answer. Thank you.
No, absolutely. Just one distinction. So our research is not funded by companies. Companies actually don't really like that we're looking into them. There's no opting in or out. We're a non-profit. The farmers' resilience improvement is at the core. When developing this benchmark, we've had several roundtables in India and Africa to look at what farmers need from these big corporations. We also have the Access to Seeds Index, assessing what the big seed companies are doing to reach smallholder farmers. And I fully agree that national assessments, and in some national food systems, these big companies don't matter as much. But we need to really hold them accountable for realizing climate goals, realizing nutritional goals. And we try to mobilize global community, big NGOs, but also the business platforms and governments and investors to push these major food companies. But on the same level, on a national level, it works very differently. Sometimes it's too complex. It's a huge reporting burden for SMEs. So there has to be a much different accountability model there. But actually, last week we launched that the methodology we've developed is free to use for everyone. It can be adapted to local situations. We encourage others to use it. India has already put it into action. Bangladesh is following. South Africa, Cameroon, and Ghana are working on also developing their own national food systems assessment, just building on all the integrated standards that we've brought together. We don't make any money of it. We just give it for free for others to use. And I fully agree, farmers should be and are at the heart of food systems transformation.
Thank you very much. It seems like certainly there's a lot for the two of you to talk about after this, and maybe that will be time to channel some of that as well. And we've only got time for one more question, so who would like to ask a question here? We'll take a question over here. We've got a woman here in the middle. Thank you.
Hello. Really great to hear some things about benchmarking and holding people to account for what targets, etc., they've put up. I'm just wondering if the panel has any view on whether GWP star versus GWP 100, measuring methane, would help as a metric to be used to report on as the science has become more firm and that is a valid measure, and it shifts the focus a little bit so that livestock production isn't going to be such a devil. We still need to work on lowering all our outputs, our emissions, and it will be beneficial to do it, but it may take some heat off that feeling that livestock is such a huge problem and making people look at plant-based when we need a very diverse food system, and making sure that people don't have prejudices in there would help. So yeah, does anyone know anything about GWP star versus GWP 100 being introduced as a measure?
I think Dr. Kropff, you were actually discussing this a little bit, weren't you? Not necessarily that, but talking about the importance of food systems. Would you like to answer this one? Would you like to answer this question?
Yeah. So the key is indeed we need variable systems, and we need to measure the things in the proper way when I understood you well, right? Measuring methane is not that simple, as we all know, but we have already made a lot of progress by improving the system, reducing methane production as a result of rice and livestock, basically. But it's not enough. So, and it's also an answer to the farmer there, because we keep on collecting data and studying to improve. But we have already so many tools that we can already use to improve our systems and also to really contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases in general. So basically mitigation and adaptation. So many people keep on focusing on adaptation, but mitigation is as important. And that's about methane, also in rice, for example. I also have been a rice scientist myself. When you grow rice, it takes so much more water, but when you do it in a time when everything is flooded, rice is the only crop you can use. So grow rice at that moment. But when it's dry, you don't have enough water, then you grow other crops. So it's basically diversifying the whole system, and livestock is an essential part of it as well, because in terms of total nutrition, it's also for many people, it's also a way of life, and it's their living, right? Especially in the fragile environments in Africa. So that's why we need to keep on innovating across the whole system, but see that we find solutions for greenhouse gas emissions in general. Okay. Thank you.
Would you like to add on to that? Please do, Dr. Yemi.
Okay. Well, very briefly, this kind of a concern came up in the previous session about the concern of methane emissions and how do we manage this. And I think from a system approach, we've got to really understand that we need an integrated approach with a multiple objective to resolve this. It's not enough to keep a one-track approach to say, yes, we have to drive down methane at all costs, but you have to look at the broad spectrum. What is the nutrient requirement to sustain productive livelihood? What about the people whose livelihood depend on livestock? Martin is indeed the right scientist. He knows a lot about what's been done to reduce methane issues coming from rice fields. But we also understand that there is the need to meet the nutrient requirement of humans. And my concern in the last session was how long will be too long when we keep pushing the genes to raise productivity, to meet requirements at all costs. We have to make sure that we strike a meaningful balance between the demands that we place on the system and what kind of shifts we have to make in our dietary requirements. It's very clear that animal protein requirement goes higher as income rises. But we need to understand that the more you raise this consumption of animal proteins, there are prices and consequences to be paid. So somehow we need to come to a reasonable balance of all of these matters. Back to you, Kasa.
Thank you very much. Yes. Right. I'd like a round of applause for our second panelist. We're going to have some closing remarks in a moment. Thank you very much for your time. So, in a moment or so, we're going to have some closing remarks. And I thought it would be really fitting. We started off this event with an incredible established voice in Johan Rockström. But given that climate change, the changes we're all facing, going to be disproportionately affecting women, the prosperity of women in the future, it only felt fitting to leave the final word to women, particularly women of the next generation as well. So I'd like to invite Miss Ingrid-Gabriela Hoven back to the panel desk here from the GIZ. Also, Miss Samantha Natumanya as well, who's a young conservationist from Uganda who co-founded Bees for Hope and looks at community-based conservation as well. Let's have a round of applause for them. So thank you very much. Samantha, right, let me just ask you, you've heard a lot of people talk. Is there anything missing from the dialogue that you've just heard here that you'd like people to keep in mind, particularly with the younger generation?
Thank you, Kasa. We've had lots of testimonies and experiences from the different experts on the panel, sharing about how food systems are actually affected by climate change from around the world. However, food systems around the world continue to be ill-prepared and bear the brunt of the impacts that are caused by climate change. For instance, the floods we see, and also... Oh.
It's okay, we'll come back to you in a moment. Just take your time, it's all good. What's important here is your words. I can hear the passion in your voice. Just try to communicate that. But while you think about that, Ms. Hoven, what I'd like to ask you is, what is the key message you would like to take home from today? Ms. Hoven, what would be the key message that you would like to take home from today? While we just wait for Samantha.
I think we have heard many important messages today. Let me start by saying again the sense of urgency, that we really can't simply do business as normal, because it has been said that the present food security system doesn't serve people and doesn't serve the planet at the same time. So, but the second point is, of course, how do we transition a system that is pretty complex? We have just heard a couple of questions saying, yeah, what about livestock, what about that? So how do we do this in a way that we actually continue to serve people and really do this in a just and fair manner? And this might be easier said than done. I think what perhaps Johan Rockström didn't allude it to so forcefully, but we may face some disruptive situations. And the question is, how are we going globally in solidarity going to handle it? Second point, apparently international cooperation also has to get fit for purpose, in the sense, if we want to really address those issues in a comprehensive and holistic way, we have to work across sectors and expert communities. We have to think more long-term. We have to be here and there more patient and make sure that we really hit the nail by doing the right things. Third message, what we don't measure won't be done. That's for sure. And we have seen a lot of examples that have been reported here at the panel, where science, evidence-based planning, digital systems can actually support evidence-based, science-based doing and decision-making. And I would fully agree with our friend from FARA that much more has to be invested in science, because unless we do so, we won't be able to capture, the many new phenomena and the volatilities that is already embedded in the system. And last but not least, it's about trust building.
Thank you very much.
And I think there we have to make sure that we really think about not in food system in a very generic way. Think about the small farmers, the small herders. Really make sure that we bring local communities on board and that we empower them to really to be an agent in the change that is needed.
Thank you so much. Right, over to you for the final word, Ms. Samantha Natumanya. What would you like people to know? What are you feeling?
Thank you, Kasa. Excuse me back there, I was a little bit thirsty. Going back to your first question where you talked about what could have been missing from the panelists, from what I heard. We've had rich testimonies and factual knowledge shared by the expert panelists that we had previous on the different panels. And we've seen how food systems continue to suffer at the hand of climate change disasters from around the world. I think it's actually really sad. We saw different stories stemming from, for instance, the Horn of Africa that has been really affected by drought. There is the floods in Nigeria and Pakistan. There is the locusts in East Africa that continue to affect the food systems and destabilize. I think this goes ahead to destabilize the communities that are at the root bearers of these burdens of climate change. So I think with all these experiences shared, there should not be room for despair, because we've had people ask what is actually being done for the farmer that is actually down there on the grassroots. So without the room for despair, my generational advice to the youth would be, we should not give up on the very food systems that have actually brought us up. As the youth, we should not give in to the challenges that we see that are happening. We should root and advocate for nature-based solutions that can go ahead to revamp the different food systems in the local areas that we come from. We should also advocate for fair and quick response mechanisms toward climate change disasters for the different vulnerable communities that we represent. But then also we should fight for education for sustainable development, because that way, without this information, the farmer shall not be better prepared for the disaster. Without this information, the smallholder farmer that is greatly contributing to the food system shall not get access to the finance. Without this information, or without fighting, all the vulnerable groups, even in the policies, shall not be fully given the attention that they need. So my advice to the youth in conclusion would be, we should hold the different stakeholders accountable, because we've seen the different panelists talk about from different stakeholders, the private sector, the government, the institutions. We should hold the different stakeholders accountable in their different sectors to see that there is actually work done, especially for the most vulnerable groups like women, youth, and the rural farmer themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for staying with me, the panelists, for the last hour and a half. I don't know about you, but for me, clearly there is a great challenge ahead, but listening to the likes of Samantha, there is clearly a call to action as well, and clearly a lot of energy and agency to ensure that we can all come together and stabilize our food systems as well. Thank you all. I've been Kasa Alam. Have a lovely day.